Before we start this week's show, I'd like to remind you that the Brazilian Report is funded by subscriptions and support from loyal readers. As well as subscribing to our website and getting exclusive daily content on Brazil and Latin America, you can also treat our staff to 1 to 5 cups of coffee a month. In return, you get exclusive benefits like special newsletters, behind-the-scenes content, as well as a shout-out here on our podcast. And today I want to thank our Buy Me a Coffee members: Mark Hillary, John Thomas III, Luis Haynes, Aaron Menes, Orlando Black, Steve Knapp, Aaron Berger, James Coney, Kars Vresvik, Alasdair Townsend, Peter Abrahamson, Michael Fryer, Miller Renascido, Jim Awolfadejo, David Dixon, Felipe Saito, José Rose Stankovic, Gabriela Graf Innes, Emerging Market Muser, Yarden Iftar, Tonica Thompson, Anderson da Silva, Kat Kramer, Fra, Peter Suffering, Anna Land, and someone who chose to remain anonymous. And if you also believe in the importance of independent journalism, and if you want to hear your name on our podcast, head over to buymeacoffee.com/Brazilian Report and subscribe to one of the membership tiers. If you cannot make a monthly commitment, you can still tip us a cup of coffee every now and then to give us the energy boost we need to cover a country as complex as Brazil and a region as complex as Latin America. Click on buymeacoffee.com/Brazilian Report to find out more. After a 3-month self-imposed exile in Florida, Jair Bolsonaro is back in Brazil.
O ex-presidente Jair Bolsonaro acaba de retornar ao Brasil após quase 3 meses.
His March the 30th return, however, was not met with fanfare. Instead, very few supporters showed up to welcome him at the Brasilia airport or at the headquarters of his party. Bolsonaro returns to a tense political landscape and a precarious legal situation. He faces a slew of accusations, ranging from his alleged role in the January the 8th riots to the attempt to smuggle expensive jewelry presented to him by Gulf nations to his attacks against the country's voting system. Beyond losing the presidency, Bolsonaro's defeat to Lula in October also meant losing legal protections that came with the office. Now, fewer than 100 days after Bolsonaro left power, one of the cases that could make him ineligible for office for 8 years reaches its final stage. For many in Brazilian politics, the writing is on the wall for Brazil's far-right former president. My name is Gustavo Ribeiro. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Brazilian Report. This is Explaining Brazil. Many around the globe compare Jair Bolsonaro to former US President Donald Trump. While the comparison has its limits, it is true that Bolsonaro has emulated many of Trump's misdoings, from attacking his country's voting system to inciting crowds to launch attacks against government landmarks. Even after both have left power, Bolsonaro could once again follow in Trump's footsteps. As Donald Trump is indicted in New York, Bolsonaro is dealing with his own run-ins with the law. To discuss these legal issues, we invite CD Silva, our Brazilian correspondent, back to the show. CD, welcome back.
Welcome back, Gustavo, and happy Easter.
So, CD, there's a slew of accusations against Jair Bolsonaro sitting in multiple courtrooms, from the Supreme Court to Brazil's top electoral body, right down to lower jurisdictions. Can you tell us a little bit about the kinds of legal trouble Bolsonaro faces after leaving the presidency?
So we can talk about 3 main groups of accusations or 3 main cases. One of them, the federal police is currently investigated, is the case of the Saudi jewels. So Bolsonaro used the administration and used his powers as president to receive illegally some Saudi jewels from the Saudi government, and these are being investigated as possible bribes. The second case is the case about Bolsonaro trying a coup and participating in the January 8 riots. His role in the January 8 riots and the role of his allies is also being investigated. And the third group, which is the one closest to reaching a verdict, is the one about currently in the Electoral Court, is the one as how he used his powers as president to try to discredit the elections and use his capacity as president essentially for his electoral campaign.
And this latter group of cases in the electoral courts, that has reached its final stage, right? Can you tell us a little bit about the details? Because there are 16 electoral lawsuits against Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil's top electoral court.
Sure, Gustavo. So as you've said, this case has now reached its final stage because on late March, the rapporteur of this case in the Electoral Court, Justice Benedito Gonçalves, he finished the part where evidence and testimonies are being admitted. So now they are ready to take this case to the floor of the Electoral Court and for the justices to vote. This case is specifically is a lawsuit that was presented during the elections by a left-wing party named the Democratic Labour Party. This is the party, as you remember, that nominated Ciro Gomes for president, and this candidate finished fourth. And this party presented this case during the elections because, as President Bolsonaro hosted dozens of foreign ambassadors at the presidential residence, and he tried to discredit the election to the foreign ambassadors.
And I remember when we covered that meeting because it was a very shady affair. We had access to the invitations the Brazilian government sent out, and it was a request for a meeting with the president, and it did not specify what would be discussed. I mean, we could say that Bolsonaro essentially ambushed foreign ambassadors to use them as props in an attempt to legitimize his campaign to spread disinformation about Brazil's voting system, right?
Precisely. So Bolsonaro, on apparently, he used this stage at the presidential residence with the foreign ambassadors to send a message to foreign governments. And he even said, without naming Lula, but he sort of asked the ambassadors not for their governments, to ask their governments for them not to recognize immediately a victory from Lula should Lula win, which was the case at the time because a few months before the election, there was a lot of speculation that foreign governments, including the government of the United States, were very ready to quickly recognize the victory of Lula to thwart any attempt at a coup in Brazil. But despite this message that Bolsonaro was sending to the foreign ambassadors, and despite him having an audience of foreign diplomats, he was actually using, as you said, the foreign ambassadors with a domestic message, trying to use them as a legitimacy platform for his message that somehow the electoral system in Brazil could not be trusted. And he presented false and misleading information about the electoral courts.
No Brasil não tem como acompanhar a apuração. Eu não sei o que vem fazer observadores de fora aqui. Vão fazer o quê? Vão observar o quê? Se o sistema é falho, segundo o próprio TSE, é inauditável também.
And he even said that it would be necessary for the armed forces to have a role in the election to avoid any problems.
Estamos a 3 meses das eleições. As propostas sugeridas pelas Forças Armadas praticamente estancam a possibilidade de manipulação de números.
So in my understanding, and we published this in the Brazilian report, he basically threatened a coup before the foreign ambassadors.
Now, as backdrop for that July 2022 meeting, we had the former president saying time and again that he would only accept defeat if he were to lose fair and square. But then he always added that caveat that with Brazil's electronic voting system, he could not rule anything out.
Precisely. It was a long-standing campaign, even before he was elected the first time, even before 2018. Bolsonaro was already sowing doubts about the electoral system's integrity, and he waged a long campaign to approve a bill in Congress that would bring back printed vote receipts. And I remember at the time, I was working on a different outlet at the time, and I was the only reporter, in my understanding, to highlight the most important speech at that time. Even though the bill to bring back the printed vote receipts failed, Bolsonaro's whip at the time, Congressman Major Vitor Hugo, he said at the House floor on the microphone, even if we lose the vote, we won the debate, because they had already placed doubts especially in Bolsonaro voters' minds about the electoral system. And this has always been his plan all the time. Even if there were people that did not support the proposal to bring back the printed vote receipts, and even if some people did not buy entirely his accusations, if some people just started having doubts, starting having some suspicion about the electoral system, then his campaign was successful.
Now, the consensus seems to be that Bolsonaro will be deemed ineligible, right? And I mean, like you said, the evidence collection phase is over. We're now moving to the closing arguments of both the defense and the electoral prosecution. How strong is the evidence weighing against Jair Bolsonaro, CD?
Okay, just for the first part of your question, Bolsonaro's most powerful allies and Bolsonaro himself have already talked explicitly on the record about the possibility that he's going to be rendered ineligible. The chairman of his party, Valdemar Costa Neto, has already been saying since late January in interviews that it would be better if Bolsonaro is not a candidate, and that there's a possibility that he will not be eligible anymore in 2026. Bolsonaro said about this while he was still in Florida. And this Wednesday, Bolsonaro's former chief of staff and now Senator Ciro Nogueira is also saying about the possibility of him being rendered ineligible. So this consensus that you speak of is also a consensus within the Bolsonaro sphere itself and with Bolsonaro himself. The evidence is very strong, Gustavo, because this meeting with the foreign ambassadors was broadcast live on Federal TV, Federal TV Brasil, which also has a YouTube channel. So before Google took the video down, the video was available for people to download, and it was broadcast live on YouTube. So the evidence of the meeting itself with the ambassadors is extremely public. It was broadcast live. Also, in recent weeks, another piece of evidence was admitted into this case, which was produced after the elections, but the Justice Benedito Gonçalves took it as evidence, and his colleagues at the Electoral Court agreed with him, which is the draft of a decree that would essentially cast a coup in Brazil. There was former Justice Minister Anderson Torres had this at his home when federal police went at his home the day he turned himself into the police. And this decree would install a commission formed mainly of people from the Ministry of Defense, that means military people, and they would do a state of emergency that would remove powers from the Electoral Court, and the Bolsonaro administration would essentially say that the election was fraudulent and it was not valid, and Bolsonaro would remain in power. This decree was not used. They never installed this commission. They never asked for this state of emergency. but the decree is proof that the Bolsonaro administration had this on their hand as a card. They held this as a possibility. And since this decree was also admitted into this specific lawsuit, it is more evidence that that President Bolsonaro used his powers as president to essentially take down democracy or to erode democracy. And this evidence was admitted in the case of the meeting with the foreign ambassadors, even though the cases are not immediately related.
So that this is also a very contentious and very political affair. How does the Brazilian public feel about these cases? I mean, it's been only 5 months since Jair Bolsonaro lost the presidency by a whisker. We can say that he is the most popular leader right of center. I mean, do Brazilians who denied him 4 more years as their president, do they want him punished?
So in Brazil, we've got some posters. Some of them are highly reputable. And Datafolha, which is one of Brazil's most renowned posters, just this week released a poll about what people believe should be Bolsonaro's fate. And 51% of interviewees believe that Bolsonaro being rendered ineligible is the correct thing to do. And 45% are opposed to this upcoming potential decision by the Electoral Court. This is very close to the electoral results we had. You've got about half of the population which believes that they want Bolsonaro out either by the vote or by the Electoral Court, and about half of the population that is going to defend Bolsonaro no matter what.
We don't have to go way back to find a former president being deemed ineligible for office, right? Lula was convicted for corruption and money laundering in 2017. His conviction was upheld in 2018, which kept him out of that year's election, an election that Bolsonaro ultimately went on to win. But then a few years later, the Supreme Court quashed Lula's convictions, and Lula was back to the political game, and he is now the Brazilian president. Some say that what happened to Lula kind of redeemed him with a lot of voters. Is there any argument to say that Bolsonaro could come out of this whole debacle as a stronger political contender, as we could argue happened with Lula?
Okay, first, I need to clarify and remember readers that Lula was rendered ineligible as a consequence of a common crime. Lula was convicted of corruption and money laundering, and there's a separate law, which is the Ficha Limpa law, which states that if you have committed a common crime, then the Electoral Court will consequentially, if provoked, render you ineligible. Bolsonaro is a different case because in this case, the Superior Electoral Court is debating for now, at this moment, it is debating a purely electoral crime and not the consequence of a common crime such as corruption, etc., which also might happen later. I believe there is an argument that Bolsonaro could come, as a stronger. The argument does exist because Valdemar Costa Neto, which is the chairman of Bolsonaro's party, explicitly said this. He said in an interview to CNN Brazil on late January that if Bolsonaro is rendered ineligible, he would be stronger by endorsing or supporting another candidate who would not have Bolsonaro's rejection rates, because that would be a person endorsed by Bolsonaro as opposed to Bolsonaro himself. So that argument does exist, but I'm skeptical about this because Bolsonaro really doesn't seem to care very much about actually going to politics again.
No, and Bolsonaro himself said he would not lead any opposition, right?
Yeah, not only that, this week he was on Monday, he was supposed to go to the Liberal Party's headquarters because he's now president of honor of the Liberal Party. And so he should attend the headquarters to work. He was supposed to go to work and he didn't. At least on Monday, he didn't. He didn't appear. So it appears that he's very ready now to enjoy a retirement. and he's not really willing to go back to politics.
So is there a timetable for the court to hand down its decision?
Yes, so we should expect the final judgment of the Electoral Court to take place by late April.
And how hard is that timetable? Because a member of the Supreme Court who also holds a seat at the Superior Electoral Court will retire. And that means, according to the court's rotational system, that the opening in the Electoral Court will go to Justice Nunes Marques, whom Bolsonaro nominated in 2020 and who has been Bolsonaro's guy at the Supreme Court. Can Nunes Marques upend this trial in any way, shape, or form?
He has one possibility. He could postpone the trial by up to 60 days, but he cannot postpone longer than that because the Electoral Court recently revised its rules of procedure so that you cannot just postpone something to the end of time. And so this lawsuit could be postponed by a couple of months, but it needs to take place this year.
With the risk of Bolsonaro being ruled ineligible, we have seen Bolsonaro's own party touting his wife, Michele Bolsonaro, as a far-right option that may carry the weight of the Bolsonaro name, but who is not necessarily sullied by Jair Bolsonaro's rude and crude firebrand personality. And I know you are very critical of that perception that Michele Bolsonaro is a viable electoral option. Can you share with our listeners why you don't buy that face value?
Yeah, correct. So once again, this understanding that Bolsonaro would be stronger endorsing someone as opposed to being the candidate himself is the understanding or the talking point by Valdemar Costa Neto and now also by former Chief of Staff Ciro Nogueira. This is not necessarily true, but this is what the Liberal Party has trying to sell to the press and to part of the Brazilian public. I believe this understanding is already in anticipation of the very likely defeat at the Electoral Court. They already know, and they have stated this publicly, that it is very likely that the Electoral Court will remove Bolsonaro from the game. And anticipating this, they already selling the figure of former First Lady Michele Bolsonaro as an alternative. It's kind of, you have parents, these parents, their kids want to go to Disney World. They cannot afford to go to Disney World, but the parents don't say no. But instead, they tease that they're going to the beach or somewhere closer. And when they finally announce that they cannot go to Disney World, they announce, you know what, we've got this, we're going to the beach. It's a consolation prize. And this is what the Liberal Party has been trying to do. They are anticipating that Jair Bolsonaro will be out of the game, and so he will be out of the game, so you can do Michele Bolsonaro as a caretaker until someone real shows up in 2026, which will probably be someone like the governor of Minas Gerais, Romeu Zema, which is basically a closet Bolsonarista, and he will be at the end of his second term, so he cannot run for governor a third time, and he will likely be endorsed by Bolsonaristas at that time.
But it is going to be a cutthroat dispute, right? I mean, do you see anyone threatening Minas Gerais Governor Romeu Zema's position as quote-unquote Bolsonaro's heir?
The cutthroat dispute is already going on. He because he's the governor of Brazil's second largest state in population, and because he's a very popular closet Bolsonarista, he was reelected without a runoff. He is probably the main figure, but there are also some other people that could also be candidates. You've got, for example, in a similar position, the governor of the southern state of Paraná, Ratinho Jr., who will also be on the end of his second term in 2026, and so he will not be able to run for governor for a third time. There are some people that would endorse Tarcísio de Freitas, but Tarcísio has the governor of São Paulo, but Tarcísio has the possibility of running for re-election in 2026, which is not available for other politicians. So I believe that cutthroat dispute is already going on, and also very publicly, as people such as Valdemar Costa Neto and Senator Ciro Nogueira are already trying to publicly sell the thing that Bolsonaro being out of the game is not a big deal, because Bolsonaro will instead support someone else. And the dispute will be, who is that someone else going to be, which is something that is going to play out over the next 4 years.
No, it is interesting because the left is haunted by a lack of options. I mean, once Lula retires from politics, they pretty much don't have anyone with that same clout or near it. And on the right, however, there's a long list of options, but no one who seems strong enough to take up the reins from Bolsonaro.
Yes, and I understand where you're coming from, but at the same time, you could reverse the outlook and say that in a very polarized scenario, if this polarized scenario keeps on over the next 4 years, the names of the candidates actually do not matter, because they will both be anti-candidates. And so people on the right are going to vote for whoever it is, as long as it is anti-PT or anti-Lula. And the same thing with people on the other side. They will vote for anyone that is anti-Bolsonaro or anti-right. And as society gets more polarized, as we have seen in the United States, the names of the candidates matter less, because people are actually voting against something rather than for something. And if the scenario repeats in Brazil, the dispute is more of internal, as who is that anti-candidate going to be, as opposed to selecting the right name for that electorate. Because you've got the electorate divided, and they're going just to vote for the anti-X or the anti-Y, regardless of that candidate is. So the dispute becomes more internal between the political leaderships, as opposed to external, trying to attract and be attractive to voters.
Cede, thank you very much, and happy Easter.
Thank you. Happy Easter to you and to your readers.
Cede Silva is the Brazilian Report's Brasília correspondent. You can follow his coverage at Brazilian.report. If you like explaining Brazil, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you get your podcasts. It takes only a second, and it will help us reach a wider audience. Or better yet, sign up for the Brazilian Report, the journalistic engine behind this podcast. We have a subscription-based business model, and your memberships fuel our journalism and keep us going and growing. Thanks to our subscribers, we have been able to cover Brazil and Latin America extensively, and for that work, we won or have been shortlisted for multiple international journalism awards. More recently, our expose about the rise of hunger in Brazil was selected by the True Story Award as one of the world's 94 best stories of 2022. In order to keep doing that work, we need your support. Go to Brazilian.report/subscribe. I'm Gustavo Ribeiro. Thanks for listening. Explaining Brazil will be back next week.